Hello, art students, 4th and 5th graders. I'm Miss Walters. I am not here with you today, but we are still going to learn about art. All right, if you remember from last class, we learned about the art movements, otherwise known as the art styles, throughout history. We're going to keep going with that, and we're going to go back a little bit and review. So I told some of you last week that don't worry about if anything in your passports was unfinished, because we're going to go back and I'm going to review with you. So make sure you are paying attention right now. My substitute is going to play this back if you don't catch anything, and let's go. Just a quick recap that early art history counts as prehistoric art starting at 40,000 BC all the way up through Mannerism ending at 1580. I know 1580 sounds pretty late to be counted as early art history, and 1600 sounds like it's pretty early to be modern art history, but that's the way it is. All right, we're going to start with the earliest art movement that we spoke about last week, the Baroque movement. Not the Broke movement, the Baroque movement. And remember, this movement incorporated music, art, architecture, literature, a lot of stuff because it took up so much time. 1600 to 1750. If last time you didn't write down that time period, look in your passport because there is a section that you need to be writing down each time period. So from 1600 to 1750, that's 150 years of art and music and lots of things. So what is the Baroque movement? The Baroque movement featured ornate, over-the-top visual arts and architecture. It was characterized by grandeur and richness. So we talked about how that meant fancy things, things that were just really bling bling and iced out. Some notable artists: Diego Velázquez, Vermeer, and Rembrandt. Our two pictures that we see here, the picture that you see on the right-hand side with the children in the big dresses, that's called Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez. And we talked about how this picture is very dramatic, it's very grand, rich. Look how ornate the dresses are. They're huge, they're bumping into each other, they're so big. And the picture on the left, I'm sorry, I got those mixed up. The picture on the left is the picture with all the big dresses. The picture on the right, The Girl with the Pearl Earring by Johannes Vermeer. Still very grand. Look at that gigantic pearl in her ear. And both pictures have that dramatic light and dark that we see in the Baroque period. All right, we're moving on. And remember, this video is going to get played over again. So if you didn't catch something that you didn't catch the first time as well, we're going to play this again. Don't worry. All right. Going back to the Romantic movement or Romanticism, which took place from 1780 to 1850. The Romantic movement emphasized the individual and imagination. Another defining Romantic idea was the appreciation for nature, and artists began to paint outside. We spoke last week about how in the Baroque movement, most paintings, almost all of them, took place on an inside, and artists began to move away from that in the Romantic movement. We also looked at these two pictures, one by William Blake, that's the picture on the left, and one by Francisco Goya, that's the picture on the right. And they have a different kind of subject matter than we would see. Lots of imagination. And we talked about how imagination is not necessarily something that is lovey-dovey romantic, even though this is called the Romantic movement. Sometimes it can be something that's dark, scary. Francisco Goya oftentimes drew his nightmares. So some notable artists: William Blake, Francisco Goya, and William Delacroix. Take a second and write that down. All right, on to the realism movement. We did talk about last week how every movement is sort of trying to get away from or moving in a different direction than the preceding movement. So if the Romantic movement is trying to move away from the ornateness and kind of superficialism of the Baroque movement, then the Realism movement is trying to move away from the over-exaggerated imaginativeness of the Romantic movement. So realism is exactly like it sounds like what it is. The realism movement featured detailed lifelike depictions of subject matter. So if something is realism, if it's from the realism movement, it's going to show what it is. So in the picture Nighthawks by Edward Hopper, that's the picture on the left, we see people sitting in a diner. So Edward Hopper drew this diner and he drew it like it is. There are no exaggerations, there are no embellishments, it is what it is. Some notable artists from this time are Courbet, Manet, and Hopper. Speaking of Courbet, the picture on the right is by him. The Desperate Man by Gustave Courbet. We talked about the lights and darks that we see in this picture, how we also saw those in the Baroque movement slide, but just because we see something having similar characteristics of the Baroque movement does not mean it's a Baroque movement painting. This is a very realistic picture. Look at the rosiness on his cheeks. We can see the individual strands of his hair, the wrinkles in his shirt, and there's really nothing grand or rich about this picture to suggest that this man is from the Baroque movement. All right, moving right along to the Impressionist movement from 1865 to 1885. Remember, we talked about how as we go along in the timeline, starting from the Baroque movement all the way up to the end, that our movements are going to get shorter. And they're going to get shorter because people are becoming more educated. They're kind of expanding their ideas. So as they do that, as they become more educated, the movements are going to become shorter. Okay, so we started with 150 years. Now we're down to about 20 years. So Impressionist painters sought to capture the immediate impression of a particular moment. This was characterized by short, quick brushstrokes and an unfinished sketch-like feel. So whereas artists in the Realism movement wanted to capture exactly what was going on, so I gave the example of a person. If we were drawing a person, we would want to draw them exactly as they are, almost like in a photograph. In the Impressionist movement, an Impressionist painter would not draw that person exactly how they are. A quick sketch-like feel. So short brush strokes, and we might not be able to tell who the person is, but we might be able to tell what they're wearing. Maybe they're a blonde person wearing a blue t-shirt and red pants. So that is just an idea of how an expressionism painter would work. Some notable artists from this movement are Claude Monet, Renoir, Degas, and Matisse. Matisse actually has a picture in this slide. The Cat with the Red Fish by Henri Matisse. He is French. A lot of Impressionism painters are French. It started in France. And while you may not consider the picture on the left, the cat with the red fish, to be Impressionism, we talked about how sometimes in a movement there are different ideas of what that movement is going to be. And look at the cat. The cat has a very kind of blurred together features. The cat's bright yellow and green as well. So it's not really as real as we would see in real life. Same thing with the background, very bright blue sky, very bright green grass, okay? So this is an example of Impressionism, just a different kind that we would see in, for instance, a Claude Monet, who did the picture on the right. Okay, and Claude Monet is what we think of when we think of a typical Impressionism, those short brush strokes, that very watercolor type of feel to it. We can't really see the details. It's kind of blurred. So 2 examples, both are correct. Both are Impressionism, just a little different. Post-Impressionism. Remember we talked last week about how a lot of the movements will lead to other movements. So this is a perfect example of how one movement, Impressionism, leads to another movement, Post-Impressionism. And they have very similar names, so it's easy to see that. And again, the movements are getting shorter. So 25 years, get shorter and shorter. So Post-Impressionism artists created subjective symbols and symbolic personal meanings rather than observations of the outside world. This is often achieved through abstract forms. So our Post-Impressionism artists are no longer interested in creating art that shows even what something looks like. And I gave the example in class about how I might be painting someone who has blonde hair, but I might draw them with blue hair. And we can actually see that's exactly what Pablo Picasso did in the picture on the left, Girl Before Mirror. He is drawing a girl with blonde hair, and he draws her with blue hair. So everything is subjective. Everything is up to the artist to interpret and put into their artwork how they choose to see it. It's how they see the world. And they use abstract forms to show that. Some notable artists from this time are Vincent van Gogh, Pablo Picasso, and Edvard Munch. And we see on the right, Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. Now, remember, we talked about how Vincent van Gogh was an impressionist, but also post-impressionist, and how a lot of artists can straddle both movements because they move through movements. So just because we see artists in both categories doesn't mean that they fall within one or the other. You can move from one movement to another movement as an artist and change your style. All right, let's move on to Expressionism. Expressionist artists sought to draw from within the artist, using a distortion of form and strong colors to display anxieties and raw emotions. So think about the term expression. Expressionism artists wanted to show emotion. They wanted to show that emotion through strong colors, through form, through a lot of shapes and lines. And again, look, we're getting shorter and shorter. Now we're only down to 15 years for this movement. So we have notable artists Mondrian, Paul Klee, Vasily Kandinsky. Paul Klee has his artwork Cat and Bird on the left, and we see the cat face and the little bird and the forehead of the cat. A very strong orange and red and green colors. And then on the right, intersecting lines by Vasily Kandinsky. We talked about how Expressionism is very similar to abstract art and sometimes can include abstractions or not. All right, and moving on. All right. We talked about Pablo Picasso, and it's interesting that Pablo Picasso kind of skipped a couple movements, but here he is again with the Cubism movement. We saw him in the Impressionism. He was in another movement. From 1907 to 1914, the Cubism movement took place. Many Cubist painters' works were marked by flat, two-dimensional surfaces, geometric forms, or cubes of objects, and multiple vantage points. Often their subjects weren't even discernible, so we couldn't even tell where the face was pointing or what was going on. Now we can usually tell what the subject is, but sometimes not. So for instance, if we're looking at the picture on the left, The Weeping Woman by Pablo Picasso, can we tell it's a face? Well, yeah, we can tell it's a face. Some notable artists from the time, Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque. Let's look at the picture on the right, because that is a picture by Georges Braque. And if we didn't have the text to tell us the title is Glass on a Table by Georges Braque, would you be able to tell that that is a glass on a table? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know if I would be able to tell that that was a glass on a table. And so that kind of shows us that sometimes their subjects were discernible, or we could tell what they were, sometimes not. So Pablo Picasso often drew portraits, and so his subject matter might have been a little bit more easy to tell what it was, but Georges Braque often drew still lifes, and so his was a little bit harder to tell what it was. All right, the Surrealism movement from 1916 to 1950. A little bit longer. So we had been getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and the Surrealism movement is a little bit longer. Part of that reason is that there were a couple wars that took place during this time, World War I, World War II, and then a period after that where artists were just making art, and just, you know, it's a little bit longer. So let's talk about Surrealism. Surrealist artists tapped into the unconscious mind to depict revelations found on the street in everyday life. I know that sounds like a lot. Let's read it again. Surrealist artists tapped into the unconscious mind to depict revelations found on the street and in everyday life. So this is one of those concepts that sounds more complicated than it really is. So all this means is that if you see a piece of Surrealism art, it has a deeper meaning. So let's look at the picture on the left. Self-portrait by Frida Kahlo. So, and remember, Frida Kahlo, we've seen her before. If you remember back to our very first project that we did with the mural by Diego Rivera, does anyone remember who his wife was? Diego Rivera's wife is Frida Kahlo. And there was a scene from his mural where she is kind of standing in the middle because he saw her as the reflection of his movement. So, and here in Frida Kahlo's self-portrait, on her forehead, she has an image of Diego Rivera. So there's a deeper meaning to that. How she's dressed has a deeper meaning. Her flowers have a deeper meaning. She's tapped into her unconscious mind to depict things from her everyday life. Okay. Some notable artists from this period are Salvador Dali, Rene Magritte, Frida Kahlo. We actually see a picture by Rene Magritte on the right-hand side, the man in the bowler hat and the apple in front of his face. Again, deeper meaning to that. Okay, what does it mean? It's not just a man with an apple in front of his face. Okay, it's called Son of Man by Rene Magritte. Now, to understand what these pictures mean, you would have to research into what the artist was going through at the time. It might be about what you think it means. Sometimes artists are not necessarily concerned with having a meaning for themselves. They really want you to figure out the meaning for yourself. And so Surrealism artists were really thinking about the deeper meaning. So right now would be a great time for you to go through your art passport, your art movement passport, and see if you have missed anything from any of the 8 art movements. I will have the substitute replay, or the teacher in the classroom, I will have them replay this video, and so you guys can catch anything you missed. And while we're replaying the video, you guys can do some sketches in the style. Also think about which one of these movements is your favorite. Okay, you're bound to have a favorite. You're bound to have a least favorite. And think about which one is your favorite. If you are going to pick a movement, if you're going to pick a movement and a period where you are going to be an artist in that movement, which one would you pick? Okay, and then go ahead and do a sketch for that movement. Now, don't copy that picture, but just go ahead and do a sketch. If you were a surrealist, what would your surrealism picture look like? If you were a realist, what would your realist picture look like? If you were a romanticism artist, what would it look like? And make sure you're following kind of the characteristics of that art style. Okay? All right. Thank you for being excellent artists today. I'm sure I will get a wonderful report. And remember, when we come back, we're going to be in our own space. That's fantastic news. I'll see you later, and keep doing what you're doing. All right, guys. Bye.